The coat hit the hallway floor before Verity Ashwood Crane, 37-year-old wife of Sutton Crane, had even stepped fully through the front door. It was a camel wool coat. She had bought it herself with her own money 3 winters ago. Sutton's mother, Marguerite Crane, 64 years old and retired chair of the Crane Family Trust, had picked it up from the hook with 2 fingers, the way you might handle something left behind by a stranger, and dropped it. "We don't pile things at the entrance," Marguerite said, not looking at Verity. "There's a closet." The closet was locked. It had always been locked when Verity visited. She had never been given a key. Sutton stood at the end of the hallway. He watched the coat on the floor. He did not pick it up. That was the first weekend Verity understood what kind of marriage she was actually in. She had met Sutton Crane 4 years earlier at a conference in Montreal. He was charming in the specific way of men who have always been told they are exceptional, fluid in conversation, generous with eye contact, easy to laugh. He worked in commercial real estate development, mid-level, comfortable. His father, Roland Crane, 68, had built Crane Property Holdings from a small Calgary land brokerage into a regional firm with 11 buildings across the Prairie provinces. Sutton was being groomed to take over. The family was proud in that quiet, absolute way that doesn't invite questioning. Verity had not told Sutton, on that first evening in Montreal, that she was the silent majority shareholder of Aldgate Capital Partners, a private real estate investment fund managing just under $2 billion in assets across Canada and 3 U.S. markets. She hadn't told him because it hadn't come up. She had introduced herself simply as a consultant in property finance, which was technically accurate. She had said she worked mostly behind the scenes. That was also accurate. They had married 14 months after they met, a small ceremony in Banff. Sutton's family had arrived with opinions about the flowers, the caterer, the seating arrangement, and the length of the reception. Marguerite had taken Verity aside the morning of the wedding and said, quietly, and with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that she hoped Verity understood what she was becoming part of. Verity had smiled back and said she did. She had not corrected the assumption underneath the statement. She had reasons for that which she kept to herself. The marriage had not been bad in any single dramatic way in the beginning. It had been bad in the accumulated erosive way that is harder to name and easier to dismiss. Marguerite called Sutton 3 times a week, always during dinner. His younger brother, Fenwick Crane, 33, borrowed money without asking and returned none of it. Sutton's father, Roland, made comments about Verity's work. Consulting, he called it, with faint amusement, as though it were a hobby she'd taken up to feel useful. At every family dinner they attended, and Sutton let it happen. Every time. He would look at the table, or refill his glass, or say something that changed the subject just enough that Verity couldn't respond directly without seeming difficult. She had tried in the first year to talk to him about it. He'd said she was being sensitive. In the second year, she'd asked him to speak to his mother. He'd said she was being unfair to Marguerite, who had only ever tried to welcome her. In the third year, she'd stopped asking. What she did instead was work. Aldgate Capital Partners had been her project for 11 years. She had built it from a thesis she wrote at Rotman and seed capital from one investor who believed in her before she had anything to show. The fund was quiet by design, no public profile, no press releases, no industry awards. The assets spoke for themselves. Her name appeared in regulatory filings and nowhere else. That was deliberate. She had always believed that power was most useful when it was not visible. What she had not anticipated was that the same invisibility would allow her husband's family to look directly at her and see nothing. It was Fenwick who finally said it out loud. They were at a Sunday dinner at Roland and Marguerite's house in Edmonton, a large, deliberately traditional home full of oil paintings and heavy furniture, when Roland brought up a problem. Crane Property Holdings was attempting to refinance the debt on its 2 largest commercial buildings. The terms from their existing lender had shifted. They needed a new capital partner, someone willing to come in at a significant level. Roland had meetings scheduled. He was not worried, he said, but he mentioned it in the way that men who are worried mention things they don't want to admit concern them. Fenwick had looked across the table at Verity and said, "Too bad you're just a consultant, Verity. Be useful to have someone with real capital connections in the family." He had laughed. Roland had smiled. Marguerite had refilled her water glass. Sutton had looked at Verity. For a moment, just a moment, she thought he might say something. She watched his face for it. He opened his mouth, then closed it, and picked up his fork. That night, driving back to their house in the west end of the city, Verity sat in the passenger seat and looked at the streetlights moving past the window and made a decision she had been approaching for a long time. She did not tell Sutton about Aldgate that night. She had never told him the full picture, and she had been watching over 3 years to see if he would create the kind of marriage where that disclosure felt safe. He hadn't, but she also hadn't left, which meant she bore some portion of what came next. What she did was call her legal team in the morning and ask them to run a thorough profile on Crane Property Holdings and its outstanding debt positions. The report came back within a week. Crane Property Holdings carried $340 million in refinancing exposure across 4 properties. Their existing lender, a mid-size institutional fund out of Toronto, had declined to extend on the original terms due to vacancy issues in 2 of the buildings. Roland had been in talks with 3 alternative lenders, all of which had, according to the timeline, already passed. The 4th lender on his list was Aldgate Capital Partners. Verity read that line twice. Then she set the report down on her desk and sat very still for a long time. Roland Crane had submitted a formal financing inquiry to her fund 6 weeks earlier. The inquiry had gone through standard intake. It was sitting in a queue, assigned to a senior associate named Deshawn Price. Deshawn had done the preliminary review and flagged it as a viable opportunity. He had not yet brought it to Verity, because it was not yet at that stage. Roland Crane had no idea that the woman he described as just a consultant at his Sunday dinner table was the sittings between him and the capital his company needed to survive the next 12 months. Verity asked Deshawn to hold the file. She did not tell him why. The moment the marriage ended, not legally but actually, was a Tuesday evening in March. Verity had come home from a day of back-to-back calls, a board session that had run long, and a 45-minute conversation with a pension fund manager in Vancouver who needed hand-holding through a term sheet. She was tired in the specific way that comes from doing demanding work while also holding everything else together underneath it. She walked into the kitchen to find Sutton sitting at the island with his laptop open and a woman named Brecon Holst, 31, sitting across from him. Brecon Holst was not a colleague. Verity knew this because she had seen the name in Sutton's phone 6 weeks earlier. She had not been looking. The screen had simply been visible, and she had recognized the frequency without needing to investigate further. She was the kind of woman who trusted her own pattern recognition. Brecon looked up and smiled with the specific composure of someone who had expected to be caught and had prepared for it. Sutton closed his laptop slowly. "We were just going over some project timelines," he said. Verity looked at him. She looked at Brecon. She set her bag on the counter and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in their room and looked at the wall for 4 minutes without moving. Then she went back downstairs, poured herself a glass of water, and asked Brecon politely if she would mind leaving. Brecon left. Sutton spent the next 2 hours explaining that nothing was happening, that Verity was reading into things, that she had always done this, made herself the victim of situations she'd misread. He used the word paranoid twice. He said that her problem was that she spent so much time in her own head, working on her consulting projects, that she'd lost the ability to trust people normally. Verity listened. She let him finish. Then she said she was going to sleep in the guest room, and she did. She did not file for divorce immediately. What she did instead was consult a family lawyer, a woman named Priscilla Aduro in Calgary, recommended by her CFO, and begin the quiet, methodical process of understanding exactly what a separation would look like from every angle: asset disclosure, jurisdictional considerations, timeline. She was above all organized. She also, during this period, made a decision about the Crane Property Holdings file. Aldgate would not proceed with the financing. The decision was not punitive, it was fiduciary. The vacancy rates in Crane's 2 largest buildings were a legitimate concern. The management approach had been reactive rather than strategic. The debt structure was inflexible. Deshawn had already noted most of these things in his preliminary report. Verity simply moved the file from under review to decline, signed the memo, and sent the formal rejection letter through standard channels. The letter arrived at Roland Crane's office on a Thursday. She was not there to see his face when he read the name on the letterhead. Sutton told her he wanted a divorce on a Saturday morning in April. He did not come to her with regret. He came with Brecon, effectively, not physically present, but present in the way that a decision already made occupies a room. He sat across from Verity at the kitchen table and said that he had not been happy for a long time, that he felt unseen in the marriage, that he needed something different. He used language that sounded prepared. Verity suspected he had rehearsed it, possibly with Brecon, possibly with Marguerite. He slid a separation agreement across the table. It had already been drafted. He had a pen in his hand. She looked at the document. Then she looked at, "You had this prepared," she said. "I wanted to be organized about it. That's considerate." She picked up the document and read it in full. It took her 11 minutes. He sat across from her and said nothing. The agreement assumed a marital estate based on his income, her consulting income as he understood it, and the jointly held property, the house. It made no reference to Aldgate Capital Partners because he did not know it existed. The proposed division was, by that framework, reasonable. He was not trying to take anything that wasn't his. He simply did not know what she had. She set the document down. She did not sign it. "I'll have my lawyer review this," she said. "I'll be in touch by the end of the week." Sutton blinked. He had expected her to sign. She could see it. He had expected her to be grateful, perhaps, for the organization of it, or to be devastated. He had prepared for devastated. She picked up her coffee, took a sip, and asked him if he wanted her to be out of the house by the following weekend, or if they needed to discuss logistics. Priscilla Oduro was very thorough. The process of full asset disclosure, once initiated, required Verity to present the complete picture of her financial position. This included Aldgate Capital Partners in its entirety, the fund structure, the asset base, the ownership stake, the income history for 11 years. Sutton's lawyer, a man named Terence Burwell, called Priscilla 4 days into the process. Priscilla had told Verity the call lasted 6 minutes. Burwell had asked, first, whether there was an error in the disclosure. Priscilla had said there was not. He had asked for a clarification on the nature of the entity. Priscilla had provided it. There was a silence on the line, she said, that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Verity was in her office at Aldgate when Priscilla called her with an update. She was reviewing Q2 projections with 2 of her analysts. She stepped into the hallway to take the call. "He didn't know," Priscilla said. "It wasn't a question." "No, his lawyer is going to want to revisit the entire agreement. I assumed as much." Verity, $2 billion in assets, 1.8, technically. Valuation fluctuates. There was a brief pause. "How long did you know you weren't going to sign that Saturday morning?" Verity looked through the glass wall of the conference room at her 2 analysts, who were laughing at something on one of the screens. "Since about page 3, she said. The asset schedule was incomplete." What followed was not a negotiation so much as a recalibration. Sutton's family learned about Aldgate in pieces, which was worse for them than learning it all at once. Roland found out first through Terence Burwell. On a Wednesday, he called Sutton. Sutton called Marguerite. Marguerite, according to what filtered back through various channels, did not speak for a full minute when Sutton told her. The financing rejection from Aldgate had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Roland had not yet connected it to Verity. He had simply absorbed the disappointment and continued looking for alternatives. When he learned that the signatory on that rejection letter, the one with the neat professional signature above the title Managing Partner, Aldgate Capital Partners, was his daughter-in-law, he sat down in his office chair and did not get up for some time. The 2 commercial buildings Roland had been trying to refinance went into a formal covenant breach with their existing lender in May. The lender issued a notice. Without a refinancing solution, the breach would trigger a default process that could affect the broader portfolio. Roland's options had narrowed considerably over the past months, and the window was now extremely short. He called Verity himself on a Friday afternoon. She was driving when the call came through. She recognized the number and let it ring through to voicemail. She listened to the message at a red light. Roland's voice had changed. The amusement she had always heard in it when he spoke to her was gone. In its place was something careful and unfamiliar. He did not mention the rejection letter. He did not mention the divorce. He asked if she might have time for a conversation, in a professional capacity. She did not return the call. Marguerite came to the house that was still technically shared, though Sutton had been staying elsewhere for 6 weeks, on a Tuesday morning. Verity was working at the kitchen table when the doorbell rang. She opened the door, and Marguerite was standing on the front step in her good coat, the charcoal one she wore when she wanted to look composed. "I think we need to talk," Marguerite said. Verity stepped back and let her in. They sat in the living room. Marguerite looked around the room with the expression of someone who has spent years developing opinions about a space. Then she looked at Verity and said she hoped they could handle everything as a family, that she believed things had moved too quickly, that she thought if Verity and Sutton simply had more time to talk. "Sutton drafted a separation agreement," Verity said. "He had it ready to sign the same morning he told me." Marguerite said that Sutton had been confused, that he'd made a mistake, that Brecon was not serious, that these things happened to men under pressure, that Sutton had been under a great deal of stress with his father's business situation. "I know about his father's business situation," Verity said. Marguerite stopped. "I know about it in some detail," Verity said. "I've read the filings. I've seen the covenant structure on those buildings. I understand what a default timeline looks like." She paused. "I also signed the rejection letter that went to Roland in March." Marguerite sat very still. Outside, a car passed on the street. Somewhere in the house, the refrigerator made a soft mechanical sound. "Sutton didn't know," Verity said. "Not because I was hiding it from him. Because he never asked. In 4 years of marriage, he never once asked me. in any real way what I actually did, what I'd built, what I knew. She looked at her mother-in-law. He told me I was a consultant. He repeated it to other people. He found it amusing, I think, the word. Marguerite opened her mouth, closed it. I'm not asking for an apology, Verity said. I want you to understand that whatever happens with Roland's buildings is a business matter, and it will be handled as one. It has nothing to do with Sutton or the divorce. I don't make decisions out of spite, she paused, but I also don't make decisions out of obligation. Marguerite left 20 minutes later. She had said very little on her way out. The divorce settlement was finalized in the fall after 4 months of negotiation. Priscilla was precise and utterly unrattled throughout. Terence Burwell adjusted his tone considerably from the first call to the last. The house went to Verity. She had made the down payment. The jointly held investment account was divided. Aldgate remained wholly hers. Sutton had no claim to assets he had never been disclosed as a part of, and the fund predated the marriage by 7 years. Sutton signed the final documents on a Thursday. Verity was not in the room. Priscilla was. She called Verity afterward and said it had been brief and quiet, that Sutton had not said anything unusual, that he had looked, she said, like a man who had just finished reading a long document and found himself at the end of it with nothing left to argue. Verity was at her desk at Aldgate when the call came. She thanked Priscilla and said she'd send the final fee by end of week. Then she set the phone down and looked out the window at the city. It was a grey afternoon, the kind of October sky that sits low and flat over Edmonton and makes the city look very wide and very quiet. She thought about the coat on the hallway floor. She thought about Fenwick's comment at the dinner table about being useful to have some with real capital connections in the family. She thought about the way Sutton had looked at her that night in the car and said nothing. She did not feel triumphant. She had never wanted triumph. What she had wanted for 4 years was for someone to look at her across a dinner table and see her. Not her usefulness, not what she could be managed into or kept quiet about or positioned as her. The person who had spent 11 years building something real, who thought in structures and long timelines, who had been alone in a hotel conference room in Montreal when she met a charming man, and made the mistake of believing that charm was the same thing as vision. It wasn't. She knew that now in the way you only know things that have cost you something. She heard about Roland's buildings through industry channels in November. The covenant breach had progressed. Without refinancing, the lender had moved to enforce. 2 of the Crane portfolio properties went through a formal receivership process. The other buildings were unaffected, but the reputational damage to the firm was significant. Roland Crane, 68, stepped back from the active management of Crane Property Holdings by December. Fenwick, who had never shown meaningful interest in the business before, briefly attempted to present himself as a stabilizing presence, which lasted approximately 6 weeks before the Board of Family Trustees asked him to step back as well. Sutton, from what she understood, had returned to his position at the firm. He was not involved in the receivership properties. He was, by all accounts, doing the same work he had always done, at the same level he had always done it. Breckenholst was no longer, apparently, in the picture. Verity had not sought that information. It had arrived the way information in mid-sized cities always does, through peripheral people who assumed she would want to know. She did not particularly want to know. What she knew was that her fund had closed a $215 million acquisition in Calgary in October, that her team was performing well, that she had hired a new senior associate who was sharp and asked exactly the right questions in every meeting. She knew that she had slept since the divorce was finalized, without the specific kind of tension she had carried in her shoulders for 3 years without fully naming. She knew that she had driven past the house in the West End once, in early November, not on purpose. She'd taken a different route and come around a corner that put her past it without warning. The lights were on. She had no idea who was living there now, whether it had been rented or sold, or whether Sutton had moved back in. She hadn't slowed down to look. Priscilla sent her a note in December. A short one, personal rather than professional, at the bottom of a billing statement. It said, "I have worked in family law for 19 years. Most people leave these processes smaller than they entered. You didn't. That's not common." Verity read it twice. Then she filed the statement in the folder where she kept that year's documents and turned her chair to face her desk and went back to work. She had a call in 10 minutes with a pension fund out of Halifax that was looking at a new position. The term sheet was on the screen in front of her, clean and very specific, every number placed where it needed to be. She had read it twice and found nothing she would change. She picked up her pen. She put on her headset. She waited for the call to connect. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was coming down over the city, slow and deliberate, covering everything evenly without preference, the way weather always does, indifferent to what it finds beneath.